In 1810, Boston, USA, a rust-colored muslin veil torn down the middle was found half-buried in the ice-packed ground behind the stone wall of St. Philomena's Convent, its edges stained a deep, browning red and frozen stiff. The garment belonged to one of the novices last seen entering the convent's south wing, a building rarely accessed by visitors and reportedly sealed for seasonal repairs since 1807. The women of St. Philomena's were known for their silent obedience, pale linen habits and careful measured movements, but it was the absence of their voices that drew suspicion, not reverence. Neighbors spoke of never hearing music or prayer, only the regular creak of a pulley and the clink of tools at dawn. Official records describe the convent as a sanctuary for girls of low fortune, opened in 1805 with 11 wards and tax-exempt under the Commonwealth's newly ratified Charter for Female Religious Education. Yet by 1810, its internal ledger listed 78 entrants and only 14 exits. How many more vanished before anyone noticed? What was the convent hiding behind its sealed south wing? Publicly praised for its rigorous schooling and austere moral order, St. Philomena's attracted donations from Boston's wealthiest Protestants, despite the Catholic nuns' foreign accents and unusually antiseptic corridors. But in a fire marshal's 1811 inventory, a locked supply room was found to contain 17 unused bed frames, all marked with names not found on the convent's official rosters, raising suspicions that could no longer be ignored. Novices now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong. Introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes. Describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g., creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 100 and 500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples. Unbelievable attention. OK. Do not use forbidden characters, Bauhaus lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Se 3 roterista ingles longa horror dis. The first recorded complaint came not from a city official, but from a shoemaker's apprentice. In late October 1806, a boy named Elias Prentice appeared before the North Square watch house, pale and shaking. According to the constable's log, he claimed to have seen a girl in white running across the convent yard barefoot, arms flailing, mouth open, yet no sound. He said she vanished behind the chapel wall, and when he approached the spot minutes later, only a single damp footprint remained on the stone path, the rest already fading under the falling dusk. Elias was dismissed, his account logged without follow-up, attributed to overwork and nervous disposition. He was 14. The convent of St. Philomena had only stood for a year by then. Built on the remnants of a failed woolen mill, its L-shaped structure was a patchwork of fieldstone and newer federal brick, with deep-set windows and narrow corridors that swallowed sound. From the outside, it looked more like a coastal garrison than a house of devotion. The sisters rarely ventured beyond the walls. Deliveries were made through a grated vestibule near the stables, payments left in a small drawer that pulled in and out like a toll box. To most of the city, St. Philomena's was a curiosity, Catholic, foreign, cloistered, yet tolerated. It was 1806, and Boston was still adjusting to the Embargo Act passed months earlier. The ports were stifled, prices surged, and talk of British retaliation buzzed through the taverns. Against that backdrop, the convent's silence was seen as a kind of dignity. But to those who lived nearby, the building exhaled unease. Abigail Marsh, whose family owned the tannery across the narrow lane, recalled in a later deposition that you could smell vinegar and lye nearly every day, even on Sundays. She described carts arriving at dawn, Sometimes 3 a week, never marked, always covered with tarpaulin. The same man drove them each time, a tall figure with a sunken left shoulder and a distinct limp. She never learned his name, and he never entered the convent, only left the carts and drove off. The carts, she claimed, were always empty when they left. It was around this time that the number of visible novices began to shrink. Children from nearby School Street, who once glimpsed lines of white-veiled girls tending the convent's narrow vegetable beds, now saw only 2 or 3 at a time. In the rare moments the heavy back gates opened, neighbors reported that the same few faces reappeared, never new ones. There were whispers that the sisters were dismissing girls, but no one ever saw them leave. One of the earliest formal inconsistencies came from within the city's own clerical machinery. On March 12, 1807, an entry in the city almoner's ledger recorded the disbursement of funds to St. Philomena's for 14 wards, food and instruction per quarter. Yet just 2 weeks later, a separate listing in the Board of Orphan Management referenced 22 permanent novices in residence, ages 9 to 17. The discrepancy was never reconciled, even after a clerk annotated both lines with the marginalia double count in faded ink. The convent did not open its doors to public inspection. Unlike Protestant homes for destitute girls, which routinely offered public reports and visitor access, St. Philomena's resisted all attempts at audit. Requests from the city were met with a firm but polite reply from Sister Agnès, the French-born prioress, whose letters bore an elegant hand and a curious absence of dates. "Our sanctuary remains devoted to healing, silence and reflection," she wrote in response to a May 1807 petition. "We do not entertain the interruptions of the outside world." Despite this resistance, stories continued to trickle in. Thomas Hurlbut, a cobbler who delivered work boots to the City Watch, noted in his 1808 daybook an odd encounter outside the convent's eastern wall. "Heard scratching," he wrote, "very faint, like iron on stone. Lasted half a minute. Stopped when I knocked on the gate. No response." In the same year, Boston's weather turned bitter. The winter of 1808 into 1809 was among the coldest on record. Frost clung to the convent's stone walls well into April. During this period, the convent stopped receiving food deliveries. Instead, 3 of the older sisters were seen collecting scraps from local market barrels, a practice unbefitting their previously austere dignity. "They looked gaunt," wrote Mary Wilcombe in a note to the local vestry, "and one dragged her foot behind her like it was frozen stiff." The vestry made inquiries. Reverend Samuel Treadwell, a Unitarian minister tasked with oversight of city charities, wrote directly to the Archdiocese in New York, which had nominal ecclesiastical authority over the few Catholic institutions in Massachusetts. He received no reply. A second letter, sent in January 1809, was returned unopened, marked "Redirected, Recipient Abroad." It was in this vacuum of oversight that the city fire marshal, Elijah Wicks, finally entered the convent under pretense of chimney inspection in March 1810. His notes, rediscovered decades later, contain no accusations, only detailed observations. South wing stairwell unlit, strong scent of bleach, dust undisturbed, no heating in lower quarters. One corridor barred with iron grille padlocked. Wicks's most curious entry was a brief notation dated March 23rd. 17 bed frames stacked in cellar, all tagged. Names do not match convent roster. Floor beneath frames, uneven. He was not permitted to return. Soon after, Sister Agnès sent a letter to the city requesting cessation of fire inspections, citing delicate health of residents. It was signed in a hand that appeared firmer and more masculine than her earlier correspondence. The request was granted, but pressure was mounting. Between 1809 and 1810, at least 5 families wrote to the convent, asking about the condition of girls who had entered the novitiate years earlier. None received replies. One letter from a widow named Jane Morley in Marblehead was returned with a wax seal unbroken and no forwarding note. Her daughter Eliza had entered the convent in 1806 at the age of 12. She was never heard from again. By mid-1810, unease turned into quiet dread. A former baker's assistant, Margaret Doyle, testified in 1814 that during her 6-month employment at the convent in early 1810, She was never permitted to enter the south wing, where a sound like water dripping could sometimes be heard through the floorboards. She was instructed never to speak to the girls directly. Meals were passed through a turntable. Each evening, she claimed, a bell rang 4 times from the wing, even though there was no known chapel in that section. She quit without notice in June 1810. Her final words on the matter: "They moved in lines, but never looked up." Você disse. Now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 100 and 150 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista Ingles Longa Horror, dice. By late summer of 1810, the trees along North Square had begun to yellow, casting uneven shadows across the convent's courtyard, now rarely swept. Flakes of mortar had started to crumble from the south wing's outer walls, revealing older stonework beneath. The building itself seemed to age faster than its surroundings, absorbing soot and grime, while other structures in the neighborhood were being whitewashed and reinforced. Several residents remarked that the convent appeared to shrink into itself, windows darkened, lanterns unlit even after nightfall. No new novices were seen entering. More troubling still, none were seen leaving. On August 9, 1810, a narrow letter was delivered to the office of the Overseers of the Poor. Its author, identifying herself only as a concerned Bostonian, described overhearing a conversation between 2 market women near Prince Street. They were speaking in low tones about a girl with bruised hands who had appeared briefly behind the convent's front grating, only to be pulled away by another woman in a dark habit. The letter ended with a single question: how many are truly within those walls? The overseers did not respond publicly, but internal minutes show the letter was passed between 3 clerks and initialed without comment. 2 days later, city physician Dr. Amos Wetherell filed a quiet request to review the convent's records of medical treatment and supplies. The request was denied. Sister Agnes, replying by courier, stated simply, "Our infirmary functions within the bounds of our vow. No secular oversight is necessary." Dr. Wetherell was not satisfied. He enlisted the help of a midwife he had worked with for over a decade, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Clarissa Pike, who agreed to pose as a visiting nurse. On the morning of August 17th, she arrived at the convent with a wrapped bundle of salves and linens. Requesting entry under the pretense of examining a girl reportedly suffering from a persistent cough, she was allowed only into the main vestibule, where she was met by 2 older sisters who kept their hands folded and spoke barely above a whisper. According to her later account, the air inside was stifling with a sour metallic tang, as if wet. Iron had been left to rust in stagnant water. Clarissa Pike was not allowed to see the girl. She asked 3 times in increasingly direct language and was told, "The patient rests in sanctified silence." Before she could respond, the door was opened behind her by an unseen hand, and she was firmly but gently guided back outside. As she stepped onto the threshold, she turned and glimpsed something down the hallway, a small heap of fabric at the base of a closed door. She later swore it was a novice's veil, crushed as if by the weight of something heavy above it. That same week, Elias Prentice, the apprentice who had spoken to the watch house 4 years earlier, reappeared at the offices of the Boston Patriot, a local newspaper with Unitarian sympathies and a quiet disdain for Catholic institutions. Now nearly 18 and working as a typesetter, Elias claimed he had kept his silence out of fear, but recent events had rekindled his unease. He asked to speak with an editor and was interviewed briefly by Samuel Bleecker, a junior correspondent. Elias shared a story from May of that year. Passing the convent on a late delivery route, he had noticed movement behind the grated cellar window at ground level. He knelt to look closer and saw what he described as 4 fingers pressed against the inside glass, trembling. He stayed for several minutes watching, but the fingers never moved again. The editor did not publish the account, but recorded it in the paper's internal journal with the annotation, "Unconfirmed, may pursue." Other residents began to keep informal watch. A local grocer named Nathan Hale, not to be confused with the patriot of the same name, kept a ledger in which he noted patterns of candlelight. According to his log, between August 1st and August 27th, the upper floor of the south wing remained dark. Then, on 3 consecutive nights, August 28th, 29th, and 30th, a single light was visible in the top right window from midnight until just before dawn. On the 4th night, the window was shuttered. Inside the city's records office, clerk Jonathan Fielding began comparing admission logs from the convent's early years to those provided by the Board of Orphan Management. He discovered inconsistencies, not just in names but in the timing of entries. For instance, a girl named Miriam Eldridge was listed as entering the convent in February 1808, according to the convent's own ledger. But the board's roster showed her in residence as early as December 1807. In a different case, a novice named Sabina Callahan appeared in the city's registry as discharged in March 1809, yet no record existed of her departure from the convents. The books. These mismatches were not isolated. They followed a pattern that Fielding quietly described to a fellow clerk as calculated omission. In September, the North Square Council quietly convened an internal session to discuss St. Philomena's. It was not a formal investigation, but a closed-door review of neighborhood concerns. Attendees included Reverend Treadwell, Fire Marshal Wicks, Dr. Wetherill, and several prominent merchants. The minutes were sparse, but a single line stands out. The convent resists inquiry, and the weight of silence now feels complicit. A motion was proposed to request an external audit by a neutral party, possibly a visiting ecclesiastical authority, from Rhode Island. The motion failed. Too many feared the political blowback of interfering with a religious institution, particularly one whose supporters included several influential donors from the merchant elite. Moreover, there remained no clear proof of wrongdoing. Only disappearances, absences, inconsistencies. The last known report from 1810 came from within the walls of St. Philomena's itself. A note was found wedged between the pages of a donation ledger returned to the city by courier. It was written in a careful but trembling hand on convent stationery, unsigned. The ink was faint, the paper slightly damp. There are rooms without air, doors nailed shut. We eat in shifts, but not all return. The prayers grow quieter. I fear the silence has begun to spread inside us. Please do not forget we were here. The letter was placed into a sealed file labeled Convent Correspondence, Unverified, and left untouched for the remainder of the decade. By winter's arrival, the convent gates closed for good. No more carts, no more candlelight. Just the slow accumulation of snow, erasing footprints as they were made. Novices now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence, and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify, do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Taisu lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 roterista ingles longa horror. Dice. In February 1811, after months of internal hesitation, the City Council of Boston permitted an informal inquiry to be opened concerning the operation of St. Philomena's Convent. The initiative was not publicized. It originated quietly, through a letter penned by Deputy Alderman Bernard Skelly, a man known for his restraint and for his deep aversion to controversy. The letter was addressed to Mr. Ansel Briggs, a former customs auditor with a reputation for discretion, who had recently returned to Boston after several years in Philadelphia. Briggs accepted the commission under the condition that his name never appear in any municipal record related to the case. His task was simple: observe, document, and report. Briggs began his observations on March 2, 1811, standing at the corner of Tileston and Moon Streets with a wax-sealed notebook tucked beneath his coat. His first impression of the convent, as recorded in his personal papers, was that it appeared entirely lifeless. No movement at the windows, no sound from within, not even the flutter of laundry. "The building gives the sensation," he wrote, "of being recently vacated and yet still watched from within." His second visit came a week later. This time he brought with him a brass spyglass concealed in a hollowed ledger. From his vantage point at the cooper's loft across the street, he noted that the shutters of the south wing had been removed, revealing windows so coated in grime they gave no clear view inside. But on 3 occasions he recorded what he described as brief vertical shadows, as of someone passing quickly along the interior corridor, never pausing, never returning. Briggs filed his preliminary notes to Skelly by courier. The City Council remained non-committal, unwilling to escalate. But word of the observations leaked. Within days, anonymous handbills began circulating through the North End, bearing the phrase, "Where are Boston's daughters?" and a crude ink drawing of a barred window. The press took notice. On March 21, 1811, the Boston Gazette printed a cautious column questioning the convent's accountability to civic authorities. The article made no accusations, but included a pointed sentence: "It remains unclear how a house of education may educate so many and yet produce so few letters home." The paper received a letter in response, signed by the Convent of St. Philomena, denying all wrongdoing and accusing the Gazette of inciting religious prejudice against the pious and cloistered. The editor attempted to verify the authorship, but the letter had been hand-delivered by a mute boy with no known connection to the convent. The city's unease began to consolidate around a few persistent voices. One of them was that of Reverend Henry Darby, an Episcopalian rector with modest standing but fierce determination. Darby had lost a niece, Ruth Garvey, to the convent in 1809. She had joined at the age of 15, against her family's wishes, and had not been seen since. After years of unanswered letters and returned gifts, Darby now stepped forward publicly. He issued a formal request to the city registrar to view all documents related to St. Philomena's admissions. His request was denied under clause of religious exemption. Infuriated, Darby sought out Ansel Briggs directly. Their meeting took place in secrecy at a printmaker's shop after hours. Darby brought with him 2 small artifacts: a faded ribbon marked with Ruth's initials, found in a donation bundle from the convent, and a sealed envelope addressed to Ruth, returned with the seal unbroken, and the words "Departed in grace" written across the front in Latin. The phrase matched a marginal note in one of the convent's earliest ledgers. Briggs agreed to escalate his inquiry. But escalation brought obstruction. When Briggs returned to the convent grounds on April 3rd, he found the front vestibule bricked over. No notice, no construction crew, just a wall of fresh mortar where the door had once been. The delivery gate to the rear was still intact, but bolted shut from the inside. The slot for packages had been welded closed. That same week, a messenger sent to retrieve a copy of the convent's charter from the Office of Religious Institutions returned with troubling news. The file was missing. Not just misfiled, but absent entirely. No record of its creation, no trace in the archives, no backup copy in the city vault. The clerk, upon review, stated plainly, "There is no legal evidence this convent was ever granted operational status by the Commonwealth." Inside the Board of Orphan Management, Clerk Jonathan Fielding attempted to retrieve his earlier annotations from 1810. The ledger in which he had marked discrepancies between entrance and exit records was gone. In its place was a new volume, dated from 1809 onward, with no signs of previous review. When Fielding confronted his supervisor, he was told, "You've made a clerical mistake, nothing more." Contradictions now multiplied. A family in Roxbury came forward claiming their daughter, Marietta Loff, had written home once in late 1808, saying she had made two close friends in the novitiate. Their names, Lillian and Clara, did not appear in any of the surviving admission records. Meanwhile, a merchant in Charlestown discovered that one of the names listed on the convent's donor wall matched that of his deceased sister, who had passed away in childbirth in 1805 and had never had any known religious affiliations. The pressure forced the Archdiocese in New York to issue a brief public statement. It acknowledged certain operational irregularities at St. Philomena's and pledged that an internal visitation would be arranged. The promised emissary, a Father Jerome Lacroix, arrived in Boston in May 1811 and disappeared from public view 3 days later. When questioned, the diocese claimed he had fallen ill and returned to New York. No travel records supported this claim. Briggs grew more cautious. He began using intermediaries, among them a young draftsman named Louis Ray, who had experience sketching architectural interiors for insurance firms. On May 12th, Ray positioned himself atop the belfry of the nearby Chapel of St. Mark and sketched the roof layout of the convent. In his rendering, he noted two vent stacks inconsistent with the building's known floor plan. Their position suggests rooms not present on the official survey from 1805, he wrote. One stack releases no smoke. Late in May, a second letter, nearly identical in tone and paper to the anonymous note found in 1810, arrived at the office of the Overseers of the Poor. It read simply, "They have begun to open the floor again. The walls breathe at night. Please, there is no sleep here." The letter bore no signature, but the script matched the previous note. Both had been written with the same slightly dulled nib, and both exhibited a rightward lean in the capital letters. The ink, tested decades later, was identified as diluted oak gall, commonly used by religious houses. Despite this, no raid was authorized, no inspection was granted. The city's silence was no longer negligence, it was protection. Verset d'ici. Now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters. Aitukara masantunma. Tidy lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rote Rista, Ingalls Longa Horror DC. By early June 1811, the silence surrounding St. Philomena's had thickened into something heavier, more than bureaucratic evasion, closer to collective avoidance. It was no longer simply that questions went unanswered. Now those who asked them found doors shut, records vanished, and allies receding. Ansel Briggs, once meticulous in his field notes, began omitting dates and locations from his entries. "This is no longer inquiry," he wrote in the margin of his ledger. "It is evasion conducted in plain daylight." The case gained its first formal witness on June 11th, when a laundress named Hester Langley approached Reverend Darby at Christ Church. She had worked briefly at the convent in the spring of 1809, hired to scrub linens and refill the copper basins. Now widowed and in failing health, she confessed she had carried the memory like a fever lodged in the bone. Hester described 3 rooms in the south wing, each windowless, each lined with cots no wider than a coffin. The air, she claimed, was choked with lime dust, and her hands bled for days after scrubbing the floors with lye-soaked cloths. She remembered a particular girl, small, no older than 10, with a locket that bore the initials JG, who helped her fold laundry without speaking. When Hester returned the following week, the girl was gone. None of the sisters acknowledged her absence. Darby recorded the conversation by hand, submitting the account to both Briggs and the Gazette, but the paper, under mounting pressure, refused to publish. Editor Samuel Endicott stated plainly, "We are not equipped for this conflict." Around the same time, Lewis Ray, the draftsman, went missing for 2 days. When he reappeared at his cousin's home in Roxbury, he was visibly shaken and unable to speak for several hours. Once coherent, he confessed he had attempted to enter the convent grounds by night, crawling through a gap in the fence near the overgrown orchard. Inside, he claimed to have seen a trench dug along the interior courtyard wall, waist-deep, freshly turned soil, no tools in sight. He did not stay long. Something made him retreat. Not a sound, but an absence of it. He described it as a stillness that pressed against my teeth like a warning. His sketches from that week show a shift in tone. Where before he rendered lines clean and proportioned, the newer drawings showed irregular forms, angles that leaned inward, and stairwells that appeared to descend below the building's known foundation. One page contained only repeated hatch marks, tight and claustrophobic. In the corner, a single phrase, "No floor stays silent forever." City physician Amos Wetherill made one final attempt to intervene, this time through the Office of Sanitary Inspection. He filed a formal petition citing health concerns, noting the absence of chimney smoke, the withdrawal of public deliveries, and the erratic waste removal. His petition was denied in a single sentence. No authority may compel entry upon the sanctified property of the convent of St. Philomena without ecclesiastical decree. But the archdiocese, now increasingly uncooperative, denied jurisdiction over the matter. A letter from their office, dated June 23rd, stated, "The convent in question operates under autonomous direction, having received provisional blessing upon foundation but no sustained oversight thereafter." The statement contradicted an earlier claim made in 1805, wherein the archdiocese had publicly endorsed the opening of the convent as a model of spiritual rigor. When questioned, the office offered no clarification. That same week, a heavy storm swept through Boston. Lightning struck the top of the south wing, searing a gash through the masonry and exposing part of the attic floor. For the first time in over a year, a portion of the interior was visible from the street. Several residents gathered in the rain to look, among them a magistrate's assistant named Caleb Minton, who later testified to what he saw. "There were no beams," he said, "only a hollow chamber. Walls of stone, no furniture, just a single metal grate set into the floor. I could see the chain links. They looked unused but not clean." The city dispatched a repair crew to assess structural danger to neighboring properties. The workers arrived on June 26th and were greeted not by a sister, but by a folded note nailed to the main gate. "Repairs unneeded, property secure. Do not enter." The workers hesitated, eventually leaving the site untouched. The gate was sealed again by the following morning. Within days, a new pattern emerged. The names of former novices, those assumed to have exited the convent, began appearing on civic registries not in relation to their departure, but their burial. Between 1808 and 1811, 7 young women were recorded as interred in Catholic plots in South Boston and Mount Hope. In each case, their deaths were attributed to unnamed fevers or unspecified infirmities of the spirit. None of the families had been notified prior to burial. In 3 cases, relatives were only informed after inquiring at the cemetery directly. One father, a laborer named Hugh Callahan, arrived at the Mount Hope grounds only to find his daughter's grave already filled and unmarked. The sexton on duty handed him a slip of paper with the name Sabina and the date May 3rd, 1810. That date matched the disappearance of a novice who had once been seen helping in the convent's herb garden. Ansel Briggs, by now watched and obstructed at every turn, prepared a sealed dossier to send to contacts in Philadelphia, fearing that the investigation would be buried before its completion. The dossier contained letters, sketches, depositions, and a partial list of known names cross-referenced against cemetery records. He never sent it. On July 1, 1811, Briggs was pulled from the investigation. The City Council, under pressure from both church benefactors and private donors, declared the inquiry without merit and formally dissolved the commission. No charges were filed. No report was published. Briggs vanished from the city within the month, his lodgings emptied, his ledger half-finished. The convent remained sealed, its gates untouched, its windows dark. In the weeks that followed, 2 more families reported returned letters bearing no seal, only the phrase "departed in grace" scrawled in red ink. The handwriting did not match that of Sister Agnès or any known scribe. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement around St. Philomena's ceased. No carts arrived, no deliveries were attempted. The air grew warmer, but no windows were opened. Only the walls remained, holding in their silence like lungs that refused to exhale. Novices now continue with Chapter 3, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery. Report the most intense and revealing moment, discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify: do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3. Roterista. Ingles longer horror. Dis. The breaking point came not from within the city, but from outside it. On the morning of August 3, 1811, a group of 4 men arrived from Worcester under orders issued by Justice Loring Peabody, who had grown increasingly suspicious of Boston's handling of the convent's affairs. Among them was Marshal Silas Cutter, a reserved but uncompromising man who had previously overseen investigations into tax fraud and unlicensed almshouses. The group carried a warrant, signed and sealed by Peabody himself, authorizing access to the grounds of St. Philomena's on the basis of persistent irregularities, failure to communicate with civic authorities, and suspicion of unlawful confinement. They arrived just after sunrise, when the convent grounds were shrouded in a low mist rising from the harbor. Cutter ordered the main gate forced open. The iron groaned and snapped at the hinges, revealing a path overgrown with weeds and matted grass. The building ahead was motionless. No one emerged to meet them. Inside the vestibule, the silence was dense. Dust blanketed every surface. A half-burnt candle stood in a brass sconce by the door, long extinguished. One of the men, a clerk named Thomas Keene, noted that the air smelled like damp lime and old wool. They passed through a narrow hallway into what had once been a reception room. Benches lined the walls. The hearth was empty, filled with soot and small bones, likely of birds, though none of the men could be certain. Papers were strewn across a side table, their ink faded by moisture. They split into pairs. Cutter and Keene ascended to the second floor. The remaining 2, carpenter Jacob Elwell and notary Elias Thatcher, moved toward the south wing. Keene's journal, later confiscated, detailed what they found upstairs. Corridors unlit, dust thick enough to leave prints in the floor, doors all ajar, no sign of recent occupancy. In one room they found rows of narrow beds unmade but not slept in. The mattresses were coarse, filled with straw, and many were stained with pale rings of sweat. At the end of the hall, a locked room bore a cross carved into the door. Cutter forced it open. Inside, the walls were lined with ledgers and shelves of labeled jars. The ledgers contained names, but the entries stopped abruptly in 1810. The jars were marked with dates and the initials of girls, CP, JG, ML. Some held dried herbs, others dark, clotted remnants of indeterminate origin. In one corner, beneath a cloth, they discovered a leather satchel containing thin strips of parchment, each with a full name and the word Dormit inked below. Meanwhile, Elwell and Thatcher reached the sealed south wing. The entrance was bricked, as previously reported, but the mortar was soft in places. They set to work with chisels, breaking through after nearly an hour. The wall gave way to a staircase descending into darkness. The steps were narrow, worn at the edges. They smelled of mold and something faintly chemical. Holding lanterns, they moved slowly, their boots stirring fine white dust that floated like ash. At the bottom, they entered a long corridor lined with closed doors on either side. The walls were stone, the ceiling low. They opened the first door and recoiled. Inside, a room no larger than a cupboard held a single chair shackled to the floor. The walls were bare, scratched in places. On the ground lay a heap of linen, too decayed to tell if it had once been bedding or clothing. The next two rooms were identical. The fourth held something worse. Here the walls had been whitewashed unevenly, and the floor was covered in fine sawdust. In the center stood a table, simple, square, stained. Upon it lay several tools, a dull knife, forceps, a broken pair of shears. Beneath the table, buried in the sawdust, Thatcher's boot struck something solid. He bent to uncover it. It was a box, nailed shut. Cutter, summoned from above, arrived as Elwell pried the top open. Inside were rows of neatly folded veils, 78, each marked with initials stitched by hand. Keene's journal described the scene. No blood, no bodies. But the absence screamed. Further exploration revealed a side passage leading to what had once been the building's sub-basement, perhaps part of the original woolen mill. Here, the temperature dropped sharply. The stones were slick with condensation. At the far end, a barred gate blocked their way. Cutter forced it open. Beyond the gate was a vaulted chamber, irregular in shape, where the ceiling had partially collapsed. In the earth beneath the rubble, something protruded. A piece of fabric barely visible stuck in the soil. Elwell reached down and pulled. What emerged was not fabric, but the sleeve of a novice's habit, still intact on the forearm it encased. Beneath it the earth was soft. Thatcher fetched a spade. They dug for hours. By mid-afternoon, 5 shallow pits had been uncovered, each containing multiple human remains. Most were incomplete, bones mingled together. No caskets, no grave markers. No ritual, just layered earth and silence. Each skeleton bore signs of malnutrition. Several showed evidence of binding, fused wrist joints, worn ankle bones. One skull displayed a long-healed fracture. Another was missing its jaw entirely. Keene, unable to continue, stepped out and vomited against the wall. They sealed the site that evening. Cutter filed a brief statement, stripped of detail. Evidence of unregistered burials and unlawful confinement discovered. Further investigation required. Immediate medical and ecclesiastical review advised. Word spread within days, though official channels remained silent. Families began gathering at the gates of St. Philomena's, weeping, demanding entry, some bringing letters, others shovels. No one was allowed past the barricades. The city posted guards, not to protect the site, but to control the living. Inside, the ledgers and artifacts were confiscated. The satchel of parchment slips was sent to the city vault. Its contents would never be returned to public record. Sister Agnes was not found. Her quarters, located in the northeast corner of the main building, had been emptied. The bed remained perfectly made. The wardrobe held only one item, a heavy wool cloak damp at the hem. On her desk lay a single page of parchment, blank but for a pressed violet, brittle and darkened with age. No formal charges were brought. No trial convened, but the name of St. Philomena vanished from city documents, struck through in the municipal register in a single line of red ink. Novices now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script. Confrontation or discovery. This part must contain between 100 and 1500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, montam, lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Inglés longa hora dice, within 48 hours of the discovery, the convent was sealed with thick wooden boards, its windows nailed shut from the outside. A crude placard was affixed to the front gate, by order of the city magistrate, reading simply, "Property under review, no trespass." Yet even as the physical structure was closed off, the weight of what had been found pressed into the surrounding. Streets like a sickness, leaching into conversation, memory, and rumor. Inside the municipal building on Court Street, the recovered ledgers and effects were moved to a back office under the supervision of 2 clerks assigned to inventory the items. One of them, a junior scribe named Elias Dunn, later recounted in a private letter to his cousin that the air around the satchel of name slips was dry and oddly fragrant, like pressed herbs and smoke. Dunn was instructed not to copy the names, only to count them. He tallied 78, not including duplicates, and noted 2 slips that had no names, only numbers and a red dot. Meanwhile, the remains uncovered in the sub-basement chamber were transferred under cover of night to the city infirmary's forensic cellar. There, Dr. Amos Wetherell and 2 assistants conducted cursory examinations. The results, now part of restricted archives, indicated an age range between 9 and 17, with a majority showing incomplete bone fusion consistent with adolescent development. At least 6 bore clear signs of long-term confinement: skeletal curvature, loss of muscle attachment, and abnormal dental wear. One skull, retrieved from the farthest pit, had been cracked in a precise circular pattern, as if by uniform impact. With a smooth, rounded instrument, Wetherell wrote, none of the remains were identified conclusively. No personal items had been buried with the bodies. The only potential clue was the presence of tiny cloth bundles in 2 of the pits, each bound with twine and containing finger bones wrapped in silk, as if preserved separately. No explanation was offered. Public reaction splintered. Some refused to believe the findings, accusing Protestant authorities of fabricating the entire affair to disgrace the Catholic institution. Others, including former donors to the convent, demanded answers. A quiet fury gripped North Square, where families of lost girls now lined up each morning to offer descriptions, artifacts, anything that might connect them to the list inside the sealed ledger room. City officials offered no confirmation, only vague assurances that all efforts toward identification are ongoing. One mother, Esther Lyon, brought a tin button carved with a tiny lamb. She claimed it had belonged to her daughter Miriam, last seen. In 1807, a clerk turned her away, saying there was no such item among the recovered effects. She returned 3 days later and forced her way into the municipal building, only to be removed by force. Witnesses say she screamed her daughter's name until her voice gave out. Pressure rose to release the names from the parchment slips, but no list was ever published. The Board of Orphan Management declared the handwriting too degraded, though records show several slips were copied by hand into an internal log marked unsuitable for public reference. The log has since disappeared. On August 9th, the Archdiocese issued a formal statement denying knowledge of any wrongdoing or deviation from ecclesiastical norms, and claimed that the convent had operated under a limited charter outside full diocesan oversight. The phrase contradicted previous statements from both the founding year and 1810, but no retraction was issued. A representative from New York arrived in Boston days later to reclaim spiritual property. He was allowed entry to the site for less than an hour. When he emerged, he was pale and refused to speak to waiting reporters. He boarded a coach to Newburyport that same evening and was not seen again in the city. Inside the convent, a final survey was conducted under the supervision of Marshal Silas Cutter and architect Merrill Bragg. The survey focused on the foundation. Beneath the brick substructure, they discovered the remnants of the original mill's drainage system, long unused stone channels that wound beneath the building. One of these opened into a collapsed chamber filled with stagnant water. There they found more cloth fragments, several rosary beads fused with rust, and a length of chain secured to a ring set into the stone. The end of the chain was empty. The room had no exit, no other entry point. Its only access was from above, through the same collapsed ceiling they had descended. Bragg's report used the phrase containment structure, but offered no theory as to its purpose. Cutter included it in his statement to the council, who chose not to act on the discovery. The room was sealed again within days. Outside, the neighborhood shifted. Children no longer played near the convent wall. Shopkeepers refused to use the lane behind the building, even for deliveries. Several families moved entirely, leaving houses they had owned for decades. The tannery across the street closed permanently. Among the few who persisted in their efforts was Reverend Darby. He submitted a formal petition to exhume the remaining grounds of the convent, arguing that more remains might be buried beneath the orchard and former garden beds. His petition was rejected. The land, the council ruled, was now under civic reclamation and deemed structurally unsound. No further digging would be permitted. On August 19th, a fire broke out at the record house near the wharf, consuming several cabinets of archived civic correspondence. Among the destroyed documents were the early communications between city officials and the convent from 1805 to 1810. The cause of the fire was never determined. No arson was declared. In the final days of that summer, Marshal Cutter compiled his notes and requested they be sealed under municipal order to prevent further disruption and unrest. His request was granted. The official file was closed on September 1st, 1811, but not all records vanished. Elias Dunn, the junior clerk, quietly kept copies of 3 of the parchment slips and stored them behind a false drawer in his family home. One of them bore the initials RG, the second CP. The third contained no name, only a spiral drawn in graphite, tight and unbroken. It was the only slip not written in ink. In his letter to his cousin, dated September 7th, Dunn wrote, "I think often of what remains under those stones, and of who might still be listening." He never returned to public service. His house was sold in 1813, contents untouched. By autumn, the name of St. Philomena's was spoken only in whispers, and even then rarely. The building remained standing for another 3 years, its facade warped by time, its southern windows forever boarded. No one moved to claim it. No plaque was mounted, no prayer was ever held for those lost within. Only the veils remained, folded and preserved in a locked drawer in the city vault. 78 pieces of cloth, 78 names, never read aloud. Vosegici now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome, arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, du denmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles longa horror dice. In the months following the official closure of the investigation, the city of Boston returned, outwardly, to its rhythms. Ships continued to arrive at the wharves, bells rang from church towers, and court sessions resumed with their usual disputes over land and trade. But beneath the surface, there remained a sense that something in the city's bones had shifted. The name of St. Philomena's was not erased. It was left to rot in place, unspoken and slowly consumed by time. No one was arrested. No charges were filed against any member of the religious order. When inquiries were made regarding Sister Agnes or any other surviving nun, officials replied with the same refrain: no record of residence. The few surviving correspondences bearing her name were quietly removed from the city's public archives and placed into restricted holdings. A single surviving portrait of her, an inkwash on linen depicting a tall, sharp-featured woman with hands clasped in prayer, vanished from the office of the overseers of the poor. When questioned, a clerk claimed it had never existed. The building stood vacant until 1814, when a minor ordinance permitted its sale as part of a larger tract of abandoned property. It was purchased under the name James Rowe, a previously unknown merchant who paid in full with silver certificates. He never occupied the building, nor did he return to Boston after the transaction. Within a year, the property changed hands again, this time as part of a shell company associated with real estate holdings in Maine. The title was transferred, but the land remained undeveloped. What followed was not justice, but silence. Reverend Darby, whose niece had vanished behind the convent walls, continued to push for public acknowledgement. He published a short tract in 1812 titled Echoes from the Hollow House, printing it at his own expense. The pamphlet included testimonies, dates, and excerpts from his interviews with witnesses. It sold only 17 copies before being denounced from pulpits across the city. Darby was asked to resign from his post, which he did without protest. He moved to Western Massachusetts the following year and died in obscurity. Marshal Silas Cutter never filed another field report. His commission was not renewed in 1813, and he retired from public life without remark. His private journal, later discovered in a carpenter's chest, ended abruptly with a single entry: "There is no verdict where the city will not look. For families of the missing, the wound never healed. No official graves were marked." No ceremony was held. The city offered no compensation, no acknowledgement, and no list. It is known from tax records that 37 households filed claims between 1811 and 1816 for lost wards. All were rejected under the clause of ecclesiastical autonomy. The Vale ledger, containing the folded remnants recovered from the underground chamber, was locked inside a drawer in the eastern vault of the records office. For a time it was listed under a fictitious case heading Textiles Miscellaneous. It remained there until the fire of 1822, when a portion of the building was destroyed. Though many assumed the drawer had been consumed in the flames, an inventory sheet from 1824 shows the entry had been quietly relisted, now under non-catalogued religious material. The ledger was no longer cited in any index. Only one relic survived in public view: a single novice veil, found folded inside the pocket of a discarded cloak during the final survey, was left unclaimed. It was mistakenly placed with the charity office's textile donations and ended up unrecognized in the collection of the Massachusetts Female Asylum. It remained in a display case labeled Conventual Garment Origin Unknown until 1849, when it was quietly removed after visitors began asking too many questions. The case was replaced with a sampler of embroidery from a girls' school in Quincy. Public memory twisted. Among the city's elite, the convent was recast as an unfortunate experiment in unchecked Catholicism. Among laborers and tradesmen, it became a whispered cautionary tale. For those who had lived closest to its gates, there were no stories told, only an absence, passed from parent to child in the form of warnings never fully explained. In 1816, a short-lived petition to establish a new home for destitute girls on the same site was met with near-unanimous resistance. The proposal was tabled, and no further attempts were made. Instead, the land sat fallow, fenced and weed-choked, until nature overtook what remained of the southern foundation. By 1819, only fragments of the convent's walls were visible above the overgrowth. Yet not all remnants faded. That same year, in a quiet alley behind Salem Street, a group of children uncovered a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 4 strips of parchment, aged and flaking. Each bore a name, an age, and a date, ranging from 1806 to 1810. At the bottom of the final strip, written in uneven hand, was a single phrase: "One remains unspoken." The children's discovery was reported to a constable who collected the bundle and submitted it to the Office of Records. The parchment strips were filed and forgotten. When the office was relocated in 1823, the strips were never logged among the transferred materials. Their current whereabouts are unknown. In the decades that followed, historians attempted to reassemble the narrative, but the sources had thinned. Letters were missing, ledgers redacted, and civic documents cross-referenced to nowhere. Each attempt met with gaps that could not be closed. Every fact seemed to crumble at its edges. No clear account survived. By 1820, the plot where St. Philomena's once stood had been removed from the municipal registry entirely. And yet some nights, beneath the hush of snow and gaslight, residents walking the narrow lanes of the North End claimed they could hear it, a sound low and rhythmic, like linen being folded by unseen hands. Voce Gisi. Now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 1 to 100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention. This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, obscene lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text. Write only and exactly. Chapter 4, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. Seri roterista, ingles longa horror dice. In the spring of 1820, nearly a decade after the final inspection of the convent, a final municipal hearing was held regarding the redistribution of the land. The proposal came from a private builder wishing to purchase the lot and adjacent properties for a series of tenement houses. During the proceedings, city records showed a brief delay when a clerk reported the lot had been miscategorized as ecclesiastical reserve. The confusion took 2 weeks to resolve. When the title was eventually cleared, the vote passed unanimously. No mention was made of the convent by name. Construction began in July. By autumn, the foundations of the new buildings were poured, but work halted repeatedly. Tools went missing. Workers refused to enter the southeastern quadrant of the lot, claiming the ground there was unstable. When surveyed, no sinkholes or erosion were found. One worker, an Irish stonemason named Flanagan, reportedly told a foreman, "It isn't the ground that shifts, it's what's under it." He was let go the next day. By winter, the southeast corner was left undeveloped. It remains an open patch to this day, used as storage or occasionally fenced off without explanation. No official ordinance prevents its use, yet no structure has ever stood there again. Those who remembered the convent aged into silence. Their children grew up hearing fragments, veils hidden in walls, names never spoken, rooms without windows. But without documentation, the memory dissolved into suspicion. Local churches did not speak of it. City authorities deflected inquiries. When the North End's records were modernized in 1835, the convent was recorded only once in a footnote regarding building permits, where it was labeled "structure demolished," prior to census. And yet one name persisted. In 1842, a young seminarian studying ecclesiastical law at the newly established Boston College came across an old index card misfiled in the archives. It bore only 2 words written in tight cursive, Philomena Agnes. There was no date, no annotation, and no context. Curious, he inquired further and was told it was likely a reference to some foreign saint. He placed the card back in the drawer, but when he returned a week later, it was gone. In that same year, a letter arrived at the city registrar's office, unsigned and postmarked from Providence. Inside was a single scrap of cloth, faded and thin, with delicate white stitching across its edge, ME 1807. The envelope contained no note, no file was opened. From time to time, documents continued to surface in odd places. A bound register of city alms disbursements, dated 1809, was discovered in the wall of a home being renovated on Charter Street. Pages had been removed at regular intervals. In 1856, a bundle of novice rosters from the Board of Orphan Management, previously assumed lost in the 1822 fire, was found beneath the floorboards of the Records Office. It included entries for names not previously recorded, along with annotations in red ink, withdrawn, no exit recorded. Each rediscovery met the same fate: quiet shelving, restricted access, or unexplained disappearance. There was no formal suppression, only a gradual erosion. The history of St. Philomena's was not erased. It was absorbed, dissolved into a wider silence the city chose never to disturb. The Vale ledger, if it survived, remains unaccounted for. No full list of names has ever been released. The land has changed hands 16 times, yet the southeastern patch remains untouched. Those who live nearby describe it simply as the square and leave it at that. Among Boston's archivists and local historians, there exists an unspoken code. Ask about the woolen mill and someone might mention the convent. Ask about the convent and the room often goes quiet. Only one researcher, a librarian named Harold Wainwright, attempted to compile the full timeline in the 1870s. His manuscript, nearly 300 pages, was rejected for publication. In the margin of the final page he had written, "I can trace the paper. I can trace the ink, but not a single voice." He died of pneumonia 2 years later. His notes remain unpublished, stored in a private collection under restricted access. As the century wore on, the story receded fully into myth. The name St. Philomena's came to signify nothing beyond a vague historical curiosity, referenced only in passing in outdated directories or oral tales passed between generations of North End families. And yet, when renovations resumed in the area during the 1890s, work crews once again refused to break ground on the southeast plot. One foreman, asked why, replied without hesitation, "Some rooms are meant to stay shut." And so they did. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source. Attention!